There are letters that arrive and ask nothing of you. They sit on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker and the unpaid electric bill, and they wait patient and harmless until you are ready to open them. And then there are other kinds of letters, the kind sealed with dark red wax, the kind that arrive at 11:47 on a Tuesday night when you are sitting at your kitchen table under a single overhead light, sorting through a stack of medical invoices that your mother left behind when she died 4 months ago. The kind that carry the name of a law firm you have never heard of, embossed in raised gold lettering on the front of a heavy cream envelope. Graves and Associates, Boston, Massachusetts. Clara Fenwick held the envelope for a long moment before she set it down next to a bill from Northwestern Memorial Hospital for $23,000. She was 28 years old. She had $47 in her checking account, $1,100 in a savings account she had not touched since she opened it at 19, and a student loan balance that she had long since stopped looking at directly the way you stop looking directly at the sun. She was a mid-level accountant at a financial consulting firm in downtown Chicago. She was good at her job. She was precise, methodical, and constitutionally incapable of letting a number go unexplained. She could find a discrepancy in a 40-page ledger the way some people find a spelling error on a restaurant menu, effortlessly, almost involuntarily, like a reflex she had never learned to turn off. None of those skills had helped her when her mother got sick. None of them helped now. She picked the envelope back up, broke the wax seal, and pulled out 3 sheets of heavy parchment paper, the kind that felt expensive in a way that made her fingers feel slightly inadequate by comparison. The letterhead confirmed it: Graves and Associates, Attorneys at Law, established 1961. A Boylston Street address in Boston, a phone number with a 617 area code. She read the first paragraph twice. Then she read it a third time. "Dear Ms. Fenwick," it began, "we are contacting you on behalf of the estate of Edna Ashworth, deceased of Blackwood Manor, Harrow Point, Maine. Our records indicate that you are the sole surviving blood relative of the deceased and have been named as the primary beneficiary in Ms. Ashworth's last will and testament." Clara set the letter down on the table. She picked it back up. She had heard the name Edna Ashworth exactly once in her life. She had been 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in their apartment in Evanston, while her mother stood at the stove making oatmeal. Clara had found an old photograph tucked into the back of a drawer. A tall woman in a dark coat standing in front of a large stone house, her face turned slightly away from the camera, as if she did not entirely trust it. "Who is that?" Clara had asked. Her mother had turned around, looked at the photograph for a moment, with an expression that Clara had not had the vocabulary to describe at 9 and could now only call grief wearing the mask of anger, and said, "Nobody. Put it back." She never mentioned Edna Ashworth again. Not once, not in the 19 years between that morning and the morning she died in a hospital room in March, with the sound of a ventilator filling the silence where her voice used to be. Clara had not known Edna Ashworth was alive until this letter told her she was dead. She kept reading. "The total value of the estate, including liquid assets, real property, art holdings, and investment accounts, had been assessed at approximately $72 million. She stopped reading again. She looked at the number for a more time, $72 million. It was a number so large, it did not feel like a number. It felt like a typographical error. It felt like the kind of figure that appeared in the spreadsheets she audited for clients she would never meet. Companies whose annual revenues were so far removed from her own financial reality that they might as well have been denominated in a foreign currency. But it was not a typo. The letter said it twice, once in numerals, and once spelled out in full the way legal documents do when they want to make absolutely certain there is no room for misunderstanding. She read the rest. The conditions of the bequest were specific, extremely specific. To claim her inheritance, Clara was required to take up full-time residence at Blackwood Manor for exactly 30 consecutive days. She could not bring guests. She could not hire outside staff. She was permitted to interact only with the estate's existing caretaker, a man named Frank Doyle who would continue to maintain the grounds during her stay. And then printed in a slightly different typeface from the rest of the document, as if it had been added at a separate time, came the final condition. Under no circumstances was she to unlock, open, or attempt to access the steel security door located in the east wing basement of the manor. If the electronic seal on the door was broken, or if Clara left the property for longer than 3 consecutive hours, the entirety of the inheritance would default immediately to a designated beneficiary entity, Apex Holdings LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands. Clara read that paragraph 4 times. Then she picked up her phone and called the number on the letterhead. The man who answered at 6:45 the following morning, after she had not slept at all, identified himself as Harold Graves. His voice was exactly what you would expect from a man named Harold Graves, who ran a law firm on Boylston Street that had been established in 1961. It was deep and measured and carefully modulated, the voice of a man who had spent 60 years choosing his words with the same precision a surgeon uses choosing a scalpel. But underneath that precision, Clara heard something she did not expect. She heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a man who was nervous. They met in his office 2 days later. The firm occupied the entire 14th floor of a building with views of Boston Harbor, the kind of office that communicated wealth and permanence and the absolute confidence of people who have never had to worry about their checking account balance. Harold Graves himself was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, silver cufflinks, shoes polished to a mirror finish. His hands, Clara noticed the moment she sat down across from his mahogany desk, were not entirely steady. He laid the will in front of her. It was handwritten, which surprised her, large sheets of yellowed parchment covered in looping, slightly erratic cursive. Edna Ashworth has handwriting, Harold confirmed, authenticated by 2 independent document examiners. He walked her through the terms again. The 30 days, the isolation, the prohibition on the east wing basement door, the Apex Holdings clause. When he finished, Clara asked the only question that mattered. What is behind the door? Harold Graves removed his glasses and set them on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man buying time. I don't know, he said. Is that the truth? He looked at her for a moment before he answered. That is what I am able to tell you, he said. It was not the same thing. Clara looked at the will again. She looked at Edna Ashworth's signature on the last page, that looping, slightly erratic cursive, the pen pressing heavily into the old parchment. Then she looked at the supplemental addendum attached behind it. The page that contained the 30-day requirement, the caretaker restriction, the basement prohibition, and the Apex Holdings clause. It was also signed in Edna Ashworth's name, but the signature was different. It was close. It was very close. Someone had been careful, attentive to the broad strokes of Edna's handwriting, the high loop on the capital E, the trailing flourish on the final H. But the pressure was wrong. The angle of the downstrokes was slightly off. The spacing between letters had a mechanical evenness that Edna's natural hand, loose and expressive and slightly trembling in the way of someone very old or very ill, did not possess. Clara said nothing. She picked up the pen Harold Graves offered her and she signed her name. But before she slid the document back across the desk, she angled her phone under the edge of the folder she had brought and photographed both signatures, Edna's and the addendums, side by side. Harold walked her to the elevator himself. They stood in the marble lobby of the 14th floor for a moment before the doors opened, and he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Ms. Fenwick, he said, and then stopped. He looked down at his polished shoes. He looked back up. I have been practicing law for 41 years. In that time, I have administered estates of considerable complexity. He paused again. This is the most unusual will I have ever seen. I want you to know that. Another pause. Trust the numbers, Ms. Fenwick. You are an accountant. The elevator doors opened. Clara stepped in. The doors closed. She stood in the descending elevator in the financial district of Boston, holding her phone, and she thought about what he had said. Trust the numbers. She pulled up the photographs she had taken. She zoomed in on the two signatures side by side, and she looked at them for the entire duration of the elevator ride. By the time she reached the lobby, she had already begun to understand. She drove to Maine 2 days later because she needed 2 days to arrange a leave of absence from work, to ask her downstairs neighbor to take in her mail and to pack. She brought 3 weeks of clothes, her laptop, two external hard drives, a stack of accounting textbooks she had not opened since graduate school, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a feeling she could not name, but that sat in the center of her chest with the dense, unignorable weight of certainty. The drive took 6 hours from Chicago. The first four were ordinary interstate highway flat Midwestern landscape, the skyline of Chicago disappearing in the rearview mirror and being replaced by nothing in particular. She stopped once for gas and coffee in a small town in New Hampshire. The last 2 hours were different. The roads narrowed. The GPS grew uncertain. The coastal fog came in off the Atlantic, thick and low, turning the pine forests on either side of the road into dark shapes that the headlights did not quite fully illuminate. The cell signal dropped to 1 bar, then to nothing somewhere on a logging road that the GPS had labeled with a name Clara could not find on any state map she had downloaded before the signal failed. And then the iron gates appeared. They materialized out of the fog like something that had always been there waiting. Tall black wrought iron elaborately worked at the top into a pattern that might have been decorative vines or might have been something else. Something that the fog made difficult to interpret with confidence. A stone wall extended from the gates in both directions and disappeared into the trees. On the left pillar, a small brass plate read, Blackwood Manor Est, 1887. Clara sat in her car with the engine idling for a moment. Then she pulled through the gates. The driveway was a long curve of gravel through overgrown grounds, old-growth oaks and wild coastal grass, and rhododendron bushes so large they had become trees themselves, their root systems pushing up through the gravel in thick, insistent ridges. At the far end of the drive, the house came into view. Blackwood Manor was not what Clara had expected, and it was exactly what she should have expected. It was enormous. Victorian, built in the New England tradition of dark stone and steep slate roofs and windows placed at angles that seemed deliberately designed to give the impression of watching. 4 stories, a turret at the northeast corner, a wide covered porch running along the front face of the house, its wooden columns wrapped so thoroughly in old wisteria that the wood itself was no longer visible. The whole structure stood on a promontory at the edge of a cliff, and behind it, invisible in the fog, but audible, a constant low roar just below the threshold of the wind, the Atlantic Ocean. The exterior stonework was black with decades of coastal moisture. The window frames had been painted white at some point, but the paint had long since surrendered to the salt air, peeling back in long strips to reveal gray wood beneath. The grounds had been maintained, barely the grass, cut, the larger branches cleared, but in the way of a place where maintenance has become a holding action against inevitable entropy rather than an act of care. It was, Clara thought, the kind of house that would have seemed beautiful once, a very long time ago. She pulled up the circular drive and cut the engine. Before she had finished gathering her jacket from the passenger seat, the front door opened. The man who stepped out onto the porch was in his early 60s, perhaps 62 or 63, with the weathered, deeply lined face of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors in a coastal climate. He was broad through the shoulders, slightly stooped, wearing dark canvas work pants and a heavy wool sweater the color of old moss. His hair was gray and cut close. He held a large ring of antique brass keys in his left hand. His eyes were pale blue. Sharp pale blue, the kind of pale blue that registered as cold even before you had time to process the expression behind them. "Ms. Fenwick," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough, a coastal Maine working accent worn into the consonants in the vowel sounds. "I'm Frank. I've prepared the master suite." "Thank you," Clara said. She took her bags from the trunk. He made no move to help her. He stepped aside to let her pass through the front door, and she went in. The interior of Blackwood Manor hit her first as smell before anything else. Old paper, beeswax candles long since burned out. Beneath those, something older and more particular, the smell of a house that had been lived in by the same person for so long that the person and the house had become chemically intertwined. And underneath everything, very faint but present, something she could not immediately identify. Something metallic. Something that reminded her at a level too low and instinctive for rational examination of copper. The foyer was 2 stories high with a grand staircase rising directly ahead of her and a row of oil portraits lining the wall as it ascended. The paintings were dark with age, their subjects wearing the formal clothes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Women in high collars, men with watch chains and expressions of absolute confidence in their own importance. Clara looked at the portraits as Frank led her up the stairs. She was almost at the landing when she saw it. One portrait, larger than the others, hung at eye level on the landing wall. A man in his 40s, perhaps 45, painted with a careful attention to detail that suggested it had been commissioned for a reason, that someone had wanted this man's face preserved and placed somewhere it would be seen. He wore a dark suit. His shoulders were square. His expression was composed and deliberate. His eyes were pale blue. The brass plate at the bottom of the frame read, Walter Ashworth, 1945 to 1991. Clara looked at the portrait. Then she turned and looked at Frank Doyle, who had paused 2 steps above her on the staircase, the ring of brass keys hanging from his hand. The resemblance was there, faint, overlaid with age and weather and time, but present in the architecture of the features, the set of the jaw, the particular angle of the brow, the way the cheekbones caught the light. She looked back at the portrait. She kept walking. Frank's tour of the house was brisk and efficient and revealed almost nothing about him except that he was a man who had learned to move through this space with the particular economy of someone who has long since stopped seeing it. The kitchen, modern appliances retrofitted into Victorian cabinetry, a walk-in freezer stocked with enough provisions for several months. The dining room, a table that could have seated 20 people and now held only a single-place setting laid at the far end, as if whoever had arranged it wanted the occupant to feel the full weight of the empty chairs. The library, a 2-story room that took Clara's breath away, floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, tens of thousands of books in varying states of preservation, a massive stone fireplace at the far end with an oak mantel carved in a pattern of interlocking vines. Edna Ashworth's desk sat in the center of the room. It was old, substantial, covered in the organized disorder of a person who had known exactly where everything was. The caretaker's cottage is a half-mile down the path to the east, Frank said, stopping at the base of the main staircase. I arrive at 8 in the morning to tend the grounds. I leave by 4 in the afternoon. I do not enter the main house unless there is a genuine emergency. Everything you need for the next 30 days is in the kitchen. The heating system is controlled by the panel in the hallway outside the master suite. If anything breaks, there is a list of service contacts in the kitchen drawer. He said all of this in a flat, even tone, as if reciting something memorized. Clara waited. In the East Wing basement, she said. He looked at her. The change in his expression was small, but absolute. The slight professional affect of a caretaker providing information to a new resident, the performance of helpfulness, vanished. Something else took its place. Something she could not name but recognized on some deep animal level as a warning. The door is locked, he said. The alarm is active. You are not to go near it. For your own sake, Miss Fenwick, pretend the East Wing does not exist. What's down there, she asked. Is it a vault, archives? He took a single step toward her, lowering his voice. Not dramatically, just enough. Edna Ashworth was a deeply private woman, Miss Fenwick. She kept things she should not have kept. She made choices that cannot be undone. Do your 30 days, collect what is yours, and leave this place. That is my only advice. He held out the ring of brass keys. Clara took it. He walked out the front door without looking back. The lock engaged behind him with a sound like a held breath finally released. Clara stood in the foyer of Blackwood Manor and listened to the silence. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a house that had held its breath for a very long time and had forgotten how to exhale. The first 3 days were an exercise in controlled anxiety. Clara occupied herself with aggressive practicality, cleaning the kitchen, organizing the pantry, learning the layout of the house, the way she learned the structure of a new accounting system, methodically room by room, filing information into categories, noting anomalies. She set up her laptop on Edna's desk in the library and worked on outstanding projects for her firm during the brief windows of Wi-Fi connectivity she found near one specific window on the second floor, standing on her tiptoes with the laptop held at shoulder height like an offering. She was careful about the east wing. She did not go near it. She did not need to. She could feel it from any room in the house, a directional presence, like knowing the ocean is behind you without turning around. The hallway that led to the east wing was visible from the dining room, and she noticed on the second day that the air temperature dropped measurably as you approached it in the way of spaces that had been closed and still for a very long time. The smell was more noticeable near the east wing, that copper metal undertone she had noticed on arrival. She could not identify it with certainty, but it settled in the back of her throat like a memory of something she had read about once and not retained. On the second morning, she opened the refrigerator and found that the produce in the crisper drawer had been replaced. She had not replaced it. She had not left the house. Frank had not entered the main house. She stood in front of the open refrigerator for a long moment. Then she closed it and made a note in the small spiral notebook she had begun carrying in her back pocket. On the third morning, she found a section of Edna's journal, a leather-bound volume discovered in the top drawer of the library desk from which 7 consecutive pages had been removed. Not torn, cut precisely along the spine with something sharp. The remaining pages on either side showed no residue, no torn edge. Someone who knew what they were doing. She photographed the journal and made another note. On the afternoon of the third day, she attempted to use the landline telephone mounted on the wall in the kitchen. She wanted to call Harold Graves. She picked up the receiver and heard nothing. Not static, not a dial tone, nothing. She followed the phone cord to where it entered the wall and crouched down to examine the connection. The wall plate had been recently disturbed. The paint around 2 of the screws was faintly scratched in the way of something that had been opened and closed again within the last several weeks. She set the receiver back in the cradle. She made a note. The fourth night brought the storm. A nor'easter came in off the Atlantic, starting at dusk, the kind of storm that the Maine coast produces with a ferocity that feels personal, as if the weather has decided to make a specific point. By 8 in the evening, the wind was loud enough that Clara could not hear her own thoughts clearly. Rain drove against the windows in horizontal sheets. The power flickered twice and then held the old house creaking and settling in its stone foundations, with the sounds of a very large, very old thing, enduring something it has endured many times before. Clara was in the library. She had built a fire in the stone fireplace and was sitting at Edna's desk working her way through the remaining contents of the drawers, utility bills dating back to the 90s, fountain pens dried to uselessness stationery, with the Blackwood Manor letterhead printed in dark green ink, a collection of rubber bands that had long since fused into a single solid mass. She was looking for something, though she could not have said precisely what. A number that didn't add up, a document that shouldn't be there. An absence where something should have been. She found neither. She found only ordinary things in extraordinary quantity. And then from directly beneath her feet, she heard it. Thump, she went still. Thump, thump. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Not the house settling against the storm, not a pipe contracting in the cold. This was the sound of intention, something or someone applying force to a surface in a regular, repeated pattern. Then it stopped. And then came the scraping. It was different from the thumping, lower-pitched, longer in duration, the sound of something heavy being moved across a rough surface. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Then silence. Clara pressed her ear to the library floor, her cheek against the worn oriental rug. Nothing. Then a sound so faint she was not certain it was real, the softest possible drag of something against something else, coming from the direction of the east wing, traveling through the structure of the house itself, through the wood and stone, and the 137-year accumulation of what the house had witnessed. She stood up. She picked up the heavy iron flashlight from the desk. She walked to the library door. Logic and a mortgage-sized inheritance told her to stay in the library, to sit back down, to remind herself that old houses make sounds in storms, that the East Wing basement had machinery heating systems, water systems that could produce exactly this kind of noise, that 30 days was not so very long, and $72 million was not a number to be discarded for the sake of a sound in the night. She walked out the library door. The corridors of Blackwood Manor at night, in a storm with no light source except the flashlight in her hand, were a different proposition from the corridors of Blackwood Manor during the day. The darkness here had depth to it. The flashlight beam illuminated a circle of floor and wall, and then fell away into nothing on either side, and the nothing on either side felt inhabited in the way that the darkness inside an empty theater feels inhabited by potential, by the weight of what has happened in a space, by the peculiar presence of absence. She moved through the dining room, through the servants' corridor, into the territory she had been avoiding, the air growing colder with each step, the copper smell growing stronger, sitting now at the back of her throat and her sinuses with a clarity that had not been there before. She reached the top of the East Wing basement stairs. They descended steeply into darkness, narrow wooden steps worn in the center by decades of use. At the bottom, barely visible in the range of her flashlight, she could see the foot of the stairs and the beginning of a concrete floor, and then the door. Even from the top of the stairs, it was wrong physically, architecturally, aesthetically wrong, the way a new bone grafted to an old skeleton is wrong. It was a heavy industrial vault door, steel, the kind used in pharmaceutical storage, or server rooms or correctional facilities, completely out of place in a Victorian manor house. A digital keypad glowed red on the wall beside it. Clara stood at the top of the stairs. From behind the door, in the brief silence between two gusts of wind outside, she heard it. A cough. Wet, ragged, unmistakably human. She scrambled down the stairs, the flashlight clattering against the wood railing, her breath loud in the enclosed space. She pressed herself against the doorframe. "Hello." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. "Is someone in there? Can you hear me?" Silence. The storm pushing against the stone walls above. Then from behind the steel, a voice. Old, weak, frayed at the edges by what sounded like the accumulated exhaustion of a very long time. "Edna," it said, "did you bring the medicine?" Clara stepped back from the door. Her heel caught the bottom stair, and she grabbed the railing to stop herself from falling. Edna Ashworth had been dead for 6 weeks. She ran. Up the stairs, through the servants' corridor, through the dining room, up the grand staircase, past the portrait of Walter Ashworth with his pale blue eyes, into the master suite, at the end of the second-floor hall, where she shoved a heavy oak chair under the door handle and sat on the edge of the bed with the flashlight in both hands, and the sound of the storm filling the room, and did not sleep. She did not sleep, but she did think. She was an accountant. She found things that didn't add up. She followed numbers to their source. Something in this house did not add up. By the time gray dawn light began to press through the heavy curtains, Clara Fenwick had made her decision. She was not going to pack her bags. She was not going to get in her car and drive back to Chicago. She was going to find out what was behind the door. She started in the library. She pulled books from shelves methodically, looking for anything that had been placed rather than shelved, anything that occupied a different kind of space. She checked behind the larger paintings on the library walls, running her fingers along the back of each frame, feeling for anything taped or folded there. She went through every remaining drawer of Edna's desk, this time examining not just the contents but the construction, the depth of each drawer against the height of the desk, looking for false bottoms, for the kind of hidden space that a deeply private woman who had spent 30 years maintaining a terrible secret might have needed. She was almost ready to give up when she noticed the fireplace mantel. It was old oak, hand-carved, the interlocking vine pattern running the full length of the mantel shelf. She had looked at it the day she arrived and seen a carving. Now she looked at it as a structure. She ran her hand along the underside of the mantel shelf, feeling the carved surface, the slight irregularities of hand-cut wood. Her fingers found the latch. It was recessed into a gap between two carved vine leaves barely large enough to catch a fingernail. She pressed it. A panel in the lower left section of the mantelpiece swung inward, revealing a space roughly the size of a shoebox packed so densely with dust that opening the panel released a small cloud of it into the firelight. Inside, a single leather-bound volume and a stack of Polaroid photographs held together with a rubber band that disintegrated the moment she touched it. The leather-bound volume was not an account book, though it had been organized with an accountant's precision. It was a medical log, dates going back 33 years, entries in Edna Ashworth's handwriting, that loose expressive cursive pressing heavily into the pages unmistakably hers. Medication names, dosages, administration times, blood pressure readings, caloric intake records, notes on cognitive status, physical condition, range of motion. Everything logged with the meticulous regularity of someone who had made this their life's work and intended to maintain it regardless of what it cost them. It was a medical log with a long-term patient, kept in secret, in a hidden compartment, in a house that, as far as anyone on the outside world knew, contained only Edna Ashworth and whatever ghost Victorian New England saw fit to provide. Clara set the log down and picked up the photographs. They were organized chronologically, the earliest ones faded almost to illegibility, the later ones clearer, the most recent dated in black marker on the white border at the bottom. They showed a single subject, a man photographed in the same location across decades. A windowless concrete room, a metal bed, a bookshelf visible in the background of some of them. The man in the earliest photographs was middle-aged, perhaps 45 or 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being looked at, shoulders back, chin-level expression controlled. As the photographs progressed through the years, the man grew older. His hair went from dark to gray to white. His frame grew thinner. The controlled expression softened into something more vacant, more inward. In the most recent photographs, he looked very old and very far away. On the front of each photograph, in the top left corner, Edna Ashworth had written a date in a single notation. The notation was the same on every photograph. Frank Doyle, caretaker. Clara looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she looked at the most recent one, taken approximately 18 months before Edna died. An old man on a metal bed in a concrete room, a man with, she brought the photograph close to the window light, a man with dark eyes. Brown, deep set, slightly downturned at the outer corners. A particular scar on his left jaw, a long horizontal line that had silvered with age. And on his left cheek, a small dark birthmark, oval, roughly the size of a pencil eraser. She set the photograph down. She thought about the man on the porch who had handed her the ring of brass keys. She thought about his pale blue eyes. She thought about the portrait on the landing and the brass plate at the bottom of the frame and the pale blue eyes of the man in that portrait. She thought about the sound that had come from behind the steel door. She thought about what Harold Graves had told her in the lobby of the 14th floor, the measured, careful words of a man who could not say what he needed to say. Trust the numbers. She put the photographs in her jacket pocket. She put the leather-bound medical log in the canvas tote she had brought to the library. She stood up from the floor where she had been sitting cross-legged in front of the fireplace, and she felt the slight unsteadiness in her legs that comes from having been still for a very long time while your mind moves very fast. She walked to the library door. She walked through the house, through the dining room, through the entrance hall, with its velvet drapes and its smell of beeswax and old paper and that persistent copper undertone. She opened the front door. The rain had slowed to a cold drizzle. The gravel drive was dark and wet. The October air came in off the Atlantic with teeth. At the far end of the drive, near the stone wall, the man who had introduced himself as Frank Doyle was unloading a flat of soil amendments from the bed of an old Ford pickup, his movements economical and practiced. Clara walked down the porch steps and across the wet gravel. She pulled the photographs from her jacket pocket. She took the one from 18 months ago, the clearest one, the one that showed the face most fully, and she placed it on the hood of the truck. She placed it carefully, deliberately, in the place where he would have to look at it. Then she looked up at the man standing 6 feet away from her, at his pale blue eyes, and she said, "I want you to open the steel door. Right now." Part 2, The Vault. The man who called himself Frank Doyle looked at the photograph on the hood of the truck for exactly 3 seconds. Clara counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then he looked up at her. His pale blue eyes moved across her face with the slow, measuring patience of someone who has spent a great deal of time learning how to read people and has become very good at it. He set down the bag of soil amendment he was holding. He straightened. He wiped his hands on his canvas work pants. He did not flinch. He did not pale. He did not do any of the things that a man confronted with evidence of something terrible would do if the terrible thing were a surprise to him. That absence of surprise was the most frightening thing Clara had seen since she arrived at Blackwood Manor. "Ms. Fenwick," he said, his Maine coastal accent was present and unhurried. "You've had a difficult night. I want you to open the steel door. I don't have the code. I'm not asking about the code. I'm asking about this." She pressed 2 fingers to the photograph on the truck hood. The man in this photograph, Edna Ashworth labeled every photograph she took the same way. "Frank Doyle, caretaker. His eyes are brown. You have blue eyes." She paused. "Tell me who is behind that door." He looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at her. Something crossed his face, and not guilt, not fear, but something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has now watched it arrive and is making a rapid series of calculations about how to respond to it. He walked to the tailgate of the truck and lowered it and sat down on it with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an old injury. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked out at the stone wall and the dark pines beyond it. "Your great-uncle Walter Ashworth," he began, "was not a good man." Clara said nothing. In 1987, the autumn of 1987, he was a senior managing partner at Ashworth Capital Group, a private investment firm headquartered in Boston. He had been building the firm since the early 1970s. By the mid-80s, he had somewhere in the range of 300 clients: pension funds, union retirement accounts, municipal investment pools, ordinary people who had spent their working lives putting money away and trusted Walter Ashworth to keep it safe. He paused. He didn't keep it safe. Over the course of roughly 7 years, he redirected approximately $40 million of client funds into a network of offshore holding accounts he controlled. He was meticulous about it. Small transfers, irregular intervals routed through enough intermediary institutions that it took the SEC nearly 4 years to follow the trail. But by October of 1987, they were close. Close enough that Walter knew they were coming. Clara stood in the cold drizzle and listened. When he understood that the investigation was nearly complete, Walter made a decision. He decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He decided to turn state's evidence. The man on the tailgate paused, and he decided to tell them that the entire operation had been conceived and directed by his sister, Edna Ashworth, who had provided the seed capital for the firm in 1971 and who had, according to what Walter planned to tell the investigators, been the primary architect of the offshore network from the beginning. Clara felt the cold of the air move through her jacket in a way it had not before. "That wasn't true," she said. "Edna provided the seed capital." "That part was true. The rest was a fabrication." Walter had kept documentation carefully selected, carefully constructed documentation that he intended to present to federal prosecutors as evidence of Edna's involvement. If he had succeeded, Edna would have faced a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Walter would have received a negotiated sentence, served perhaps 3 years in a minimum security facility, and walked away with enough hidden offshore assets to rebuild his life entirely. He stopped. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the cliff, the Atlantic was working itself against the rocks. So Edna moved first, Clara said. Edna moved first. She had grown up with Walter. She knew how he thought. She understood that when he decided to act, he would act completely and without hesitation. So she acted first. He looked at her. She paid a substantial amount of money to a small number of people who knew how to make a boating accident look convincing. In October of 1991, Walter Ashworth was reported lost at sea off the coast of Nantucket during a solo sailing trip. His body was never recovered. The investigation into Ashworth Capital Group continued for another 2 years, but ultimately produced no criminal charges because the primary subject of the investigation was legally dead. Clara looked at him steadily. "And she brought him here," she said. She had the East Wing basement converted while Walter was still in Boston, still planning his testimony, still unaware that Edna knew what he was doing. By the time Walter understood what was happening, it was too late. She had him. She built the vault. She installed the medical equipment. She kept him alive, and she kept him buried. It was her version of justice. He said the word justice in the flat, uninflected way of someone who is reporting a fact they have not yet decided how to feel about. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't she just let him go to prison?" she said. "Because if Walter went to federal prison, he would have told them things about Edna that were true. Not the fabricated architecture of the embezzlement scheme, but other things, financial things, arrangements Edna had made over the years that she did not want examined under federal discovery. Prison for Walter meant exposure for Edna." He paused. And because Edna was, in certain specific ways, a very controlled person, prison meant lawyer's testimony, public record. The basement meant silence. "And you've been maintaining that silence." He said nothing. "Open the door," Clara said. "Ms. Fenwick." He stood from the tailgate. "I want you to think carefully about what you are doing. Opening that door triggers the electronic alarm. The moment the seal breaks, the inheritance defaults to Apex Holdings. $72 million. Your debts, your mother's medical bills, your future." He paused. All of it gone. For a man who embezzled $40 million from pensioners and then tried to send his own sister to prison for it. Clara held his gaze. He was persuasive. The logic was sound. The argument was clean and internally consistent, and it was delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had been preparing it for a long time. And it was designed, she thought, with the precision of something that had been built to serve a specific purpose. "I'll figure out the code myself," she said. She picked up the photograph from the truck hood and walked back to the house. She did not run. She made herself walk at a normal pace across the wet gravel, up the porch steps, through the front door, and into the entrance hall before she leaned against the closed door and let her breath out. He had said something he should not have been able to see. When he described the interior of the East Wing basement, the vault, the medical equipment, the conversion of the space, he had spoken with the specific textured precision of someone describing a place they know from direct experience. Not from description, not from secondhand account. He had used the present tense in one sentence, then corrected himself to past tense in the next, a small slip, the kind of slip that only happens when a person's knowledge of a place is recent and embodied, rather than historical and abstract. A man who had merely been told about the basement would not have made that slip. A man who had been living in it would. Clara went to the library. She sat at Edna's desk and opened the medical log to the first entry dated January 1988. She read with the systematic attention she gave to a new client's books, not looking for anything in particular, letting the structure of the document reveal itself before imposing interpretation on it. The entries were regular, every 3 days a meal notation, every week a blood pressure reading and a brief note on physical condition. Every month, a longer entry covering medication adjustments, any significant changes in behavior, or health notes on what the subject had requested, if anything. She read forward through the years. The entries from the early 90s were written in a firm, controlled hand. By the mid-90s, there were occasional references to difficulties. The subject had refused medication for 3 days. The subject had not eaten. By the early 2000s, Edna's handwriting had begun to show the first signs of age, a slight loosening of the precision. Occasional words crossed out and rewritten. And then in an entry dated March 2001, a sentence that changed everything. Arthritis in both hands now severe enough to prevent descent of the east staircase. Have arranged for FD to take over weekly medical checks. FD begins next Monday. Clara stopped. FD, Frank Doyle. The real Frank Doyle had begun descending into the vault in March 2001. He had been trusted with the most dangerous secret in the house, given the master keys, allowed access to the one place that had been locked and guarded and kept from every other living person for 10 years. She kept reading. The entries from 2001 onward were written in two hands. Edna's still present, but increasingly sparse, providing oversight and medical direction. And a second hand, neater, more vertical, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship properly and had maintained the habit. Frank Doyle's entries: medication administered, vitals recorded, behavioral notes. The dual-authored entries continued through 2002, through the first months of 2003, and then in an entry dated September 14, 2003, Edna's handwriting returned alone. Incident in the vault. FD incapacitated. W has been contained. New arrangements in effect. Nothing else. No elaboration. No detail. The entry was dated and signed, and that was all. After that date, the handwriting in the log was exclusively Edna's, but changed tighter, more compressed, with a quality of controlled distress in the pen pressure that Clara recognized from her own handwriting during the worst months of her mother's illness. She sat with that entry for a long time. Then she turned to the back of the log. The final pages were different from everything that had come before. The handwriting was still Edna's, but frantic, the letters large and uneven in the way of someone writing quickly or in pain, or in the grip of a clarity that comes at the very end of things. Dated entries from 2022 and 2023, Edna's last years. She read them slowly. The stockpile in the sub-vault is sufficient for transition. Timer set for 70 days. He will have enough to survive my passing, but the system will begin to fail after that point. I cannot be certain of the heir's arrival date. I am not certain of anything anymore, except that I am running out of time, and there is only one thing I can still do that matters. Clara turned the page. The code Edna had written, 101987. The day everything ended, the day I understood what he was. If she is who I believe she is, she will find this. If she is what I need her to be, she will know what it means. I have tried to do what was right. I know now that what was right and what I did were not always the same thing, but I am too old and too tired to disentangle them. All I can do is leave her what she needs to finish it. God forgive me. God help her. The entry was signed with Edna Ashworth's name and dated 14 months ago. Clara closed the log. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and the fire burning low in the stone fireplace, and the sound of the Atlantic beyond the cliffs steady and indifferent. Then she opened the log again and turned to the financial notes she had seen tucked into the back inside cover. 3 sheets of paper folded, small, covered in Edna's later handwriting, lists of account numbers and institution names and transfer dates. Clara was an accountant. She did not need long. Apex Holdings, LLC, appeared in the notes with a registration date of 2018. registered in the Cayman Islands. No named principals visible in the documentation Edna had been able to gather. But Edna had noted the transfer pattern, small irregular deposits from her own accounts beginning in 2019, each one below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, each one routed through a different intermediary before arriving at Apex. She had not made those transfers voluntarily. She had noted as much in the margin in handwriting, so compressed it was almost a code in itself, not my instruction. Coercion. Cannot prove without exposing everything. Clara looked at the registration date again. Apex Holdings had been created in 2018. Frank Doyle, the real Frank Doyle, had been reported as having had an incident in the vault in September 2003. She looked at the drawer of Edna's desk, the bottom right drawer that she had gone through on her first full day in the house, and found unremarkable. She opened it again. She removed everything and placed it on the desk surface. Utility receipts, a broken letter opener, a small glass jar with a cork stopper half filled with what looked like fine white powder. She picked up the jar and held it close to the library window. The powder was very fine, very white, with a slight luminescence in the gray morning light, completely odorless when she removed the cork. She replaced it and set it back on the desk. She crossed to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and ran her finger along the spines of the reference volumes of medical dictionaries, pharmaceutical indexes, toxicology, references, the kind of library a person assembles when they have a long-term medical situation to manage and no outside professional to consult. She found the toxicology reference on the fourth shelf and opened it to the index. She found what she was looking for in under 3 minutes. Arsenic trioxide, organic form, soluble in hot liquid, tasteless, odorless, in low consistent doses produces symptoms indistinguishable from several common age-related conditions: fatigue, cognitive decline, gastrointestinal disturbance, progressive weakness. She looked at the jar on the desk. She thought about Edna Ashworth, who had spent 30 years maintaining a secret that grew heavier every year, who had in her final years described being coerced, who had died in this house with a man she did not entirely trust, managing access to her chamomile tea. She put the jar in her tote bag. She turned back to the medical log and found what she needed in the upper right corner of the page dated October 10, 1991. The first entry made after Walter Ashworth's staged death, the first record of the man in the vault beneath his house, 101,987. Written in Edna's hand pressed deep into the parchment with the particular force of something that had been decided, something that was not going to change. October 10th, 1987, Black Monday, the day the global markets crashed. The day the SEC's existing investigation into irregular fund movements suddenly became something else entirely because federal investigators who had been watching modest irregularities watched them become catastrophic losses and began looking much harder at who had moved what and when. The day Walter Ashworth had known with certainty that his time was running out. Edna had chosen that date as the code, not a birthday, not an anniversary, the specific moment at which the man behind the door had made the choices that led him to the door. The moment his fate was sealed, and he had first begun to think about making sure Edna's fate was sealed along with it. Clara closed the log and put it in the tote bag with the jar. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. Outside, the October sky had cleared slightly. The storm had pulled east, leaving behind the specific sharp brightness of coastal New England in autumn, the light carrying no warmth at all, but an extraordinary clarity. She had approximately 90 minutes before the man calling himself Frank, returned to the caretaker's cottage for the evening. She needed to find the alarm line first. She had spent 3 days moving through this house, and she had the accountant's habit of noting infrastructure, where the electrical panels were, where the plumbing accessed the exterior walls, where the communication lines entered the structure. She had seen on her first day an anomaly in the East Wing corridor that she had filed away without fully examining a conduit running along the base of the wall, separate from the main electrical conduit, Thinner, older, painted over so many times it had become part of the wall's texture, but still distinguishable if you knew what to look for. She found it in the East Wing corridor, followed it with her eyes to where it entered the wall near the floor, then found it again in the kitchen, running behind the baseboard to the old telephone junction box mounted near the back door. The junction box contained two lines. One was the residential telephone line. She could see where it had been cleanly cut, the copper ends, slightly bright where the insulation had been stripped. Recent work. The second line was older. The wire itself was a different gauge, the insulation a different color, the connection style predating the residential line by at least 20 years. It was intact. It ran from the junction box through a separate conduit into the wall, and Clara traced it with her eyes to where it disappeared toward the east wing. She found the terminal in the east wing corridor mounted in a small metal box at floor level, almost invisible beneath the accumulated paint of 137 years. She crouched and opened it. Inside, a simple analog relay terminal, a single line and a single line out. A small adhesive label in the box faded to near illegibility. Reading direct alarm, Harrow Point Sheriff's Department installed April 1989. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the terminal for a moment. Then she looked at the keypad junction visible at the far end of the corridor where the east wing basement stairs descended into darkness. She understood. The alarm terminal was connected to the basement door's electronic seal. When the seal was broken, when the correct code was entered and the door was opened, it would not only unlock the door, it would trigger this relay. It would send a signal direct in analog and completely independent of the residential telephone system to the Harrow Point Sheriff's Department. Walter had cut the residential phone line. He had done it carefully as someone who had thought through the infrastructure of his prison and identified the communication channels he needed to eliminate. He had been thorough. He had not found this line. He had not known it existed. It had been installed 3 years before he arrived at Blackwood Manor, routed through a separate conduit connected to a terminal hidden at floor level in a corridor that Edna had arranged to be inaccessible to him for 33 years. It was Edna's last fail-safe, her long-buried insurance policy. Clara picked up the handset of the alarm terminal. She heard a dial tone, slightly fuzzy but unmistakably present. She sat on the floor of the east wing corridor of Blackwood Manor for a long moment, with the handset in her hand, listening to that dial tone. Then she dialed Harold Graves. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she had found: the medical log, the arsenic, the Polaroids, the financial transfers to Apex Holdings. She told him about the voice behind the door, and about the man on the porch whose eyes did not match the photographs. She told him about the supplemental addendum with the forged signature. She spoke for 11 minutes. Harold Graves listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. Then he said, "I knew the addendum was wrong. I told him I wouldn't file it. He sent me documentation suggesting I had participated in the original account restructuring in 1987. It wasn't true, but it would have been sufficient to end my career and likely result in criminal charges." He paused. "I am so sorry, Ms. Fenwick." She told him what she was going to do. She told him what she needed him to do. She gave him the Harrow Point Sheriff's Department number from the label inside the terminal box. Then she called that number directly and asked to speak to whoever handled major crimes. A woman named Detective Sylvia Carr came on the line. Clara spoke for 23 minutes. She was precise. She was thorough. She provided dates, names, account numbers, and a summary of the physical evidence she had in her possession. She described the location of Blackwood Manor, the layout of the east wing, the position of the vault door. Detective Carr said very little. She was the kind of person who understood that her job in this particular moment was to listen. At the end, she said, "Don't go down there alone, Ms. Fenwick." Clara looked at the terminal box in the corridor and the darkness at the top of the east wing basement stairs. "I'll wait until 2 in the morning," she said. "He'll be in the cottage by then." Carr said, "We'll be positioned on the access road. The moment that alarm triggers, we move." Clara replaced the handset in the terminal. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the library. She ate a bowl of soup from a can she found in the kitchen. She read for 2 hours, not Edna's documents, but an actual book, a novel she had brought from Chicago because she needed her mind to rest before it needed to work again. She made a fire. She sat in front of it and watched the flames and listened to the house settle around her in the cold October night. At 1:45 in the morning, she put the medical log in the jar and the Polaroid photographs in her tote bag. She put on her jacket. She picked up the flashlight. She walked through the house for the last time as someone who did not know the full truth of it, down the corridor, into the east wing, the temperature dropping with each step, the copper smell thick and close. At the top of the basement stairs, she paused. From below, in the absolute silence of 2 in the morning, she heard it again. Not a thump this time, not a cough, a soft, persistent scratching. Barely audible, the sound of someone who has been making whatever sounds they can make for a very long time and has not stopped because stopping feels like something that cannot be undone. Clara descended the stairs. The vault door loomed in her flashlight beam, its keypad glowing red, the heavy steel surface cold enough to feel from 2 feet away. She stepped up to the keypad. She thought about what this moment cost. $72 million, the end of debt, the beginning of a different kind of life. Everything that the number represented, everything she had been told, was on the other side of 30 days of obedience. She thought about what Edna had written in her final pages. I have tried to do what was right. She pressed 1, 0, 1, 9, 8, 7. The keypad emitted a single electronic tone, high and clean. The red light turned green. The bolts fired. The door opened. The air that came out of the vault hit her like a wall-cold medicinal threaded through with the smell of a closed space and human occupation and something sweetly chemical that she recognized from the toxicology reference she had read that afternoon. She raised the flashlight and stepped over the threshold. The room beyond was not what she had imagined. She had imagined a cell, bare concrete iron fittings, a stripped-down architecture of punishment. What she found was something more disturbing than that because it was more considered. The vault was large, perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet, with an 8-foot ceiling. The floors were covered in hospital-grade linoleum white, the kind designed to show contamination clearly. To the left, a stainless steel kitchenette with rows of empty silver tubes, the nutritional paste she had read about in the log. To the right, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf crammed with decades of accumulated reading material. And in the center, beneath, fluorescent fixtures that had long since burned out, an adjustable hospital bed surrounded by a constellation of medical machinery, an oxygen concentrator, an IV rack, a heart monitor with a dark screen. On the bed, a figure beneath a white thermal blanket. Clara moved closer. The man lying on the bed was old. He was very old, and he had the specific appearance of someone who has been still for too long. The skin loose and translucent over the bones, the muscle tissue reduced to a minimum. The whole physical structure of the body slowly surrendering to horizontal gravity. His hair was white and tangled against the pillow. His hands rested on top of the blanket, the fingers curled slightly inward, the skin marked with deep bruising along the tendons. He was alive. She could see the shallow, irregular movement of his chest. She moved the flashlight to the side, letting the ambient glow reach him without blinding him. "Hello," she said quietly. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids moved. They opened slowly, adjusting. He turned his head toward her with the careful, deliberate movement of someone managing pain. His eyes found her face. They were brown. Deep brown, slightly clouded with age and weakness, but present. Aware. She looked at his left cheek. The small, oval birthmark was there just as it had appeared in the Polaroids. "My name is Clara Fenwick," she said. "I'm Edna's great niece. I'm the heir. I've found the medical log. I've found your photographs." She paused. "Are you Frank Doyle?" The man on the bed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in a voice worn down to almost nothing by years of disuse, "Yes." One word. barely audible, but certain. She crouched beside the bed. You're safe now. I've already contacted the sheriff's department. There are officers on their way. She paused. The man outside, the man calling himself Frank Doyle, I know who he is. Something moved across the old man's face. A wave of emotion too complex and too long accumulated to name. Walter, he said. Yes, he closed his eyes. A single slow exhalation as if he were releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. He came down here, Frank said, his voice barely a thread, in 2003. September, I had been doing the medical checks for 2.5 years. I trusted Edna, trusted me. I should have been more careful. He paused for breath. He had been working something loose from the bed frame. I didn't know. I leaned over to check the IV line and another pause. When I woke up, I was on the bed. He had my keys, my clothes. He had already been practicing my voice, my walk. He had been watching me for 2 years and studying everything. His eyes opened again. He is very good at becoming other people, Miss Fenwick. He has been doing it his entire life. I know, Clara said. Edna, in the end, did she? She left you the code, Clara said. She left it in the log where she knew I would find it. She knew what had happened. She just couldn't prove it without exposing everything. She paused. She didn't leave you there on purpose, Frank. She couldn't get you out safely, but she made sure someone would. He turned his face away from her toward the wall, and she understood that he needed a moment that was his alone. She stood and moved back toward the vault door, and from the darkness of the corridor beyond the door, a voice said, I have to admit, Clara, I didn't think you had the stomach for it. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the vault. The transformation was complete and immediate and deeply wrong in the way of something fundamentally unnatural. The stooped posture was gone. The rounded shoulders, the slightly labored gait, the whole physical grammar of a working man in his 60s who had spent 40 years outdoors gone as if it had been a coat that he had simply removed and dropped in the corridor outside. The man standing in the doorway of the vault was tall. His shoulders were squared. His spine was straight. His hands were loose at his sides, relaxed the hands of someone entirely comfortable with the situation they were in. In his right hand, held casually against his thigh, was a length of rusted iron rebar. His eyes were pale blue and completely still. When he spoke again, the Maine coastal accent was gone. What replaced it was the voice of a specific kind of Boston. Old Boston inherited Boston, the voice of a man who had grown up in a house with a portrait of his grandfather in the entrance hall and had never had occasion to doubt that the world was arranged for his benefit. In doing so, Walter Ashworth said, stepping fully into the vault, You have just made me a very wealthy man. The alarm has triggered. The seal is broken. My attorneys in the Cayman Islands received an automated notification 30 seconds ago. The transfer to Apex Holdings is initializing. He moved the rebar from one hand to the other with a slow, deliberate ease. I want you to know that I genuinely did not intend for this to be unpleasant. It was always going to be a tragedy, of course, the new heir overwhelmed by the isolation and the history of this terrible old house, losing her footing on the basement stairs in the dark. A dreadful accident, but I had hoped it would be quick. He took another step toward her. You have complicated that hope somewhat, he said, but not beyond remedy. Clara stood at the center of the vault beside the hospital bed, where Frank Doyle lay watching with dark, exhausted eyes, and she looked at Walter Ashworth. She did not step back. She reached into her jacket pocket, and she took out her phone and she held it up between them. The screen was dark. No signal. No bars. Walter smiled. It was a thin, patient smile, the smile of a man who has already accounted for all the variables. The residential lines are cut, he said. I handled that 3 days before you arrived. Your cell signal has been dead since you turned off the logging road. He raised the rebar slightly. Whatever you think you have in your hand, Clara, it is not a way out of this room. Clara looked at the phone in her hand. Then she looked at him. You cut the residential lines, she said. I know. I found where you cut them. Very clean work. She paused. But you didn't audit the full infrastructure of the house. You identified the systems you knew about. You missed the one you didn't. Something moved in his pale blue eyes. Very small, very fast. A flicker of something that was not quite certainty encountering something that was not quite doubt. Edna installed a dedicated hardwired analog alarm line in 1989, Claire said. It runs through a separate conduit from the residential system. It connects directly to the Harrow Point Sheriff's Department. It bypasses every communication channel you identified and eliminated. She watched his face. It has been intact this entire time. I have found it this afternoon. I used it to make 2 phone calls. The faint sound that had been building outside the stone walls of Blackwood Manor for the last 30 seconds became suddenly unmistakably clear. Sirens. Multiple units, their sound compressed and amplified by the cliff face and the surrounding stone, traveling down the access road toward the iron gates at a speed that suggested they had not come from far away. Walter Ashworth's face did something she had not seen it do before. It went very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing a situation. The rigid, absolute stillness of a man watching a structure he built with great care and patience and intelligence collapse all at once in a direction he had not anticipated and could not reverse. The rebar came down. It struck the linoleum with a flat metallic sound and rolled a few feet and stopped. He did not move toward her. He did not move toward the door. He simply stood in the center of the vault beneath the burned-out fluorescent lights and looked at Clara Fenwick with pale blue eyes that were doing the rapid, diminishing arithmetic of a man counting his remaining options. From above, the heavy front door of Blackwood Manor opened. Boots on floorboards, multiple sets moving fast, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who know what they are doing and have been briefed on the layout. A voice called down the stairs, Harrow Point Sheriff's Department. We are entering the East Wing basement. Anyone in the vault, do not move. Walter Ashworth looked at Clara one final time. In that look was hatred, genuine and deep, the accumulated fury of a man who has spent 33 years planning a thing and has watched it end in the last 30 seconds. But underneath the hatred, barely visible, was something else. Something that looked, despite everything, like the involuntary and deeply unwanted recognition of one intelligent person for another. Clara looked back at him. She said nothing. The boots reached the bottom of the stairs. The beam of a tactical flashlight swept the vault doorway. And then Detective Sylvia Carr stepped through 2 uniformed officers behind her in the small, terrible room at the bottom of Blackwood Manor, filled for the first time in 33 years, with people who had come to set it right. Part 3. The reckoning Walter Ashworth did not fight. That was the thing Claire would remember longest in the months that followed, when she turned the night over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath it. Not the sirens, not the tactical flashlights sweeping the vault walls, not the sound of handcuffs engaging around the wrists of a man who had been legally dead for 33 years. What she would remember was the absence of resistance. He went to his knees on the hospital-grade linoleum with the slow, deliberate care of a man lowering himself into a chair at the end of a long day. His hands moved behind his head without being told twice. His pale blue eyes stayed on Clara's face until the officers turned him and the geometry of the room no longer permitted it. There was no plea, no performance of innocence, no final maneuver. Just a man finally out of moves doing the arithmetic one last time and finding it came to 0. Detective Sylvia Carr was in her mid-40s, compact and efficient, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to do their best thinking in rooms where other people are panicking. She stood in the center of the vault and took in the hospital bed, the IV rack, the empty nutritional tubes, the burned-out fluorescent fixtures, the decades of accumulated medical equipment, and her face registered all of it with the controlled, meticulous attention of someone who understands that what she is looking at is going to matter enormously in a courtroom and must be seen correctly the first time. She turned to Clara. "You said there were 2 calls," Carr said. "Harold Graves, the estate attorney in Boston, and you. The attorney knows everything you told me. Everything I found in the log, the arsenic, the forged addendum, the Apex Holdings transfers." Clara paused. "He was coerced into filing the fraudulent will addendum. He'll cooperate fully." Carr nodded once, the nod of someone adding a confirmed item to a mental list. Then she looked at the hospital bed where Frank Doyle had not moved, his brown eyes tracking the room with the careful, overwhelmed attention of a man trying to process a reality he had stopped believing would ever arrive. "Sir," Carr said quietly, moving to the bedside. "My name is Detective Sylvia Carr, Harrow Point Sheriff's Department. You are safe. We are going to get medical personnel down here in the next 20 minutes. Can you tell me your name?" The old man on the bed looked at her for a moment. "Frank Doyle," he said. His voice was barely there, worn to a thread by years of disuse and the accumulated damage of malnutrition and medical neglect. I've been down here since September 2003. Carr looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I understand. We're going to take care of you, Mr. Doyle." She straightened and turned back to her officers. She began issuing instructions in the clipped, precise shorthand of someone who has run crime scenes before and knows exactly which details, if mishandled in the first hour, will cause problems in the 5th year of appeals. She called for an ambulance. She called for the State Police Major Crime Unit. She established the vault as a primary scene and requested an evidence team from Augusta. Clara stepped back against the vault wall and watched it all happen around her. She had not moved in several minutes. She became aware, standing there against the cold steel wall with her tote bag over her shoulder, that her hands were shaking. Not with fear that had passed somewhere in the seconds between Walter dropping the rebar and the first boot hitting the basement stairs. What was moving through her hands now was something else. The physiological aftermath of sustained intensity, the body finally permitted to acknowledge what the mind had spent hours refusing to feel. She pressed her palms flat against the cold steel wall and felt the shaking slow. One of Carr's officers had Walter on his feet and was moving him toward the vault door. As he passed, Clara Walter turned his head and looked at her one final time. She met his gaze. There was nothing she wanted to say to him. She had said everything that needed to be said in the moment that mattered, and she understood instinctively that anything further would only be for her own benefit, a performance of closure that the moment did not require. She was not interested in performances. She looked at him with the same level, unhurried attention she brought to a set of books that had been deliberately falsified, clear-eyed, precise without drama. Walter Ashworth looked away first. They took him up the stairs and out of the house. Clara heard the front door of Blackwood Manor open and close, and the old house settled back into itself around the sound of his exit, as if exhaling for the first time in decades. The evidence team arrived from Augusta at 4:30 in the morning. They were thorough and methodical, and they worked through the remaining hours of darkness and into the morning, documenting the vault with the careful attention it deserved. Clara sat in the library and answered Carr's questions for 2.5 hours, going through everything in chronological order: the letter Boston, the forged signature, the 3 anomalous days, the nor'easter, the sound through the floor, the hidden compartment, the medical log, the arsenic jar, the financial notes, the alarm terminal. She put the tote bag on Edna's desk and removed its contents one by one, placing each item in the evidence bags that Carr's team provided: the medical log, the Polaroid photographs, the small glass jar with the cork stopper. When the jar went into the evidence bag, Carr looked at it for a moment without touching it. "You found this in Edna's desk drawer," she said. "Bottom right drawer, 3rd day. You didn't dispose of it." "It's evidence," Clara said. "You don't dispose of evidence." Carr looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. The paramedics took Frank Doyle out of the vault on a gurney at 5:15 in the morning. Clara stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor and watched them carry him across the gravel to the ambulance. The cold October pre-dawn pressing in from the Atlantic, the pines absolutely still in the absence of wind. He was alive. Severely malnourished, clinically dehydrated, with documented soft tissue damage, and the early markers of organ stress that come from prolonged inadequate nutrition, but alive and conscious and in the ambulance. He apparently asked the paramedic attending him what year it was, and upon being told was quiet for a long moment, before he said very softly that he had rather thought it might be something like that. They transported him to Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor. Clara watched the ambulance lights disappear down the access road. Then she went back inside and made coffee in the kitchen and sat at the long dining room table as dawn came through the heavy curtains and turned the room from black to gray to a pale, watery October gold. She was still the heir to Blackwood Manor. She was sitting in it on the 22nd of 30 required days, and the requirement was now rendered legally meaningless by the evidence currently being processed by the Harrow Point Sheriff's Department and the Maine State Police Major Crime Unit. But she was here, and the house was around her, and she thought she might as well finish the coffee. She thought about Edna Ashworth, whom she had never met. A woman who had made a terrible choice in 1991 and then spent 33 years maintaining it with a ferocity that had cost her everything: her public life, her family, her freedom, her health, and eventually, if the white powder in the glass jar was what Clara believed it was, her life. A woman who had in her final months understood that the structure she had built to contain one terrible thing had become a terrible thing itself, who had, with whatever was left of her strength, done the only thing she could still do. She had left a trail. Numbers in the corners of pages. A code pressed deep into old parchment. An alarm terminal at floor level in a corridor she had made sure to keep inaccessible for 33 years. A supplemental addendum with a signature just wrong enough that someone paying very close attention would notice. She had needed the right person to follow it. Clara drank her coffee and looked at the pale October light coming through the curtains, and thought that she was not certain she had been the right person. She was certain only that she had been the person available, and that she had done what the numbers asked of her, and that sometimes that was sufficient. It took the federal system 6 months to do what it does, which is to say it moved with the grinding, inexorable slowness of a process designed to be correct rather than fast, and then arrived at an outcome that was in Clara's estimation both. The federal courthouse in Boston was a building that communicated authority through sheer mass granite and glass, the kind of architecture that is not trying to be beautiful and is not trying to be welcoming, and makes no apologies for either. Clara sat in the gallery on the morning of the final sentencing hearing wearing a charcoal suit she had bought 3 weeks earlier, the first new piece of clothing she had purchased in 4 years. That was not a functional replacement for something worn out. She was sitting in the gallery, not at the prosecution table, because she was a witness and an heir and a private citizen who had handed everything she found to the people whose job it was to do something with it. She had done her part in a conference room in the federal building 6 weeks earlier, sitting across from 2 assistant U.S. attorneys and a special agent from the SEC's Enforcement Division, going through the financial documents for 5 hours with the methodical precision she brought to every set of books she had ever been given to examine. The 2 assistant U.S. attorneys had asked at one point where she had learned to read offshore account structures. Graduate school, she had said. In 30 years of precedent, my great-aunt left in a hidden compartment behind a fireplace mantel. Harold Graves was at the prosecution table, seated beside his own attorney, having entered a cooperation agreement with the government 6 weeks after Walter Ashworth's arrest. He had provided the original unaltered version of Edna Ashworth's will, which he had kept in a private safe in his home, rather than the office files, a decision he described to the prosecutors as the only thing he had done in the entire affair that he did not regret. He had provided documentation of the coercion Walter had used to compel his cooperation with the fraudulent addendum. He had provided records of his communications with Walter going back to 2019, when Walter had first made contact with Graves under the pretense of being a financial advisor engaged by Edna. His cooperation had been complete. His sentence when it came was 3 years probation, a substantial fine and permanent disbarment. He accepted all three without comment. Walter Ashworth sat at the defense table in a Department of Corrections jumpsuit that was the same institutional orange as every other DOC jumpsuit in every other federal facility in the country, and the deliberate anonymity of it was, Clara thought, the first genuinely fitting thing that had happened to him in 33 years. He had spent 3 decades maintaining a specific constructed identity, the weathered caretaker, the subservient groundskeeper, the humble man who occupied peripheral space and drew no attention. The jumpsuit made that construction impossible. There was no role available to him in it. His defense had attempted 4 different arguments over the course of the preceding months. None of them had gained traction. The medical log, 33 years of Edna Ashworth's handwriting, documenting every aspect of the vault and its occupant, was unimpeachable. The Polaroid photographs provided visual documentation of a man's physical deterioration over 3 decades. The toxicology report on the contents of the glass jar confirmed as arsenic trioxide combined with the tissue analysis from Edna Ashworth's exhumed remains, which showed chronic arsenic accumulation, consistent with low-dose long-term poisoning over approximately 18 months, established cause of death, with a clinical certainty that removes arguments from defense counsel and puts them on the floor where they belong. Frank Doyle testified from a wheelchair because his legs had not yet fully recovered their function, and because the physical therapy team at Eastern Maine Medical Center had determined that the nerve damage from 21 years of limited mobility was going to require at least another year of intensive rehabilitation before he could walk without assistance. He spoke for 2 hours and 17 minutes. He was precise and specific and entirely without self-pity, which Clara thought was either evidence of remarkable character or evidence of what 21 years in a concrete room does to the part of a person that has the energy for self-pity. The courtroom was very quiet while he spoke. The gavel came down on a Tuesday morning in April, the light coming through the courthouse windows at a low spring angle that made the wood paneling glow with a warmth the room did not otherwise possess. Walter Ashworth was found guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree, premeditated with special circumstances in the death of Edna Ashworth. Kidnapping with bodily injury sustained over a period exceeding 1 year in the person of Frank Doyle. Identity theft, sustained impersonation and obstruction of justice. Criminal fraud in the falsification and filing of testamentary documents. Securities fraud and embezzlement pursuant to the reopened 1987 federal investigation, for which the statute of limitations had been told by reason of the defendant's fraudulent death and assumed identity. Life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He would trade the vault at Blackwood Manor for a cell at a federal correctional institution, and the difference between the two was largely administrative. He had engineered one concrete room and earned another, and he would occupy the second one until he died in it, which was, Clara thought, the kind of outcome that has the structure of a sentence completed. She did not feel triumphant sitting in that gallery. She felt a particular quiet satisfaction of a long column of figures that has been checked and rechecked and has come out correct. It was enough. The practical business of inheriting $72 million turned out to require approximately the same qualities as auditing a large and complicated set of books: patience, precision, and the ability to sit with complexity for extended periods without demanding that it simplify itself prematurely. Clara worked through it with her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Osgood, whom she had found through a referral from one of her professors at Northwestern, and who had the invaluable quality of explaining things once clearly and then not explaining them again. The fraudulent addendum was nullified by the federal court's order, which meant that the 30-day residency requirement and the Apex Holdings clause were removed from the will entirely, and Clara inherited under the terms of Edna's original document, which was straightforward and unconditioned, and simply said that everything went to the sole surviving blood heir. Apex Holdings, LLC, was dissolved by court order by its assets, a modest amount. Walter had not yet completed the transfers he had planned, were seized and added to the restitution fund established for the victims of the 1987 Ashworth Capital Group embezzlement. That fund, administered by the SEC's Enforcement Division, would take years to fully distribute, but it would reach in some form and in some amount the people and the pension funds and the municipal accounts that Walter Ashworth had drained in the autumn of a different century. It would not make them whole. It never does. But it was the correct direction. The first thing Clara did the morning after the sentencing was call the business manager of Eastern Maine Medical Center and establish an irrevocable trust in Frank Doyle's name. The trust was funded at an amount she had calculated precisely enough to cover the highest tier of private assisted living for 30 years with a full medical and physical therapy allowance, a personal account for whatever Frank wanted to spend on books or anything else, and a provision for private transportation to wherever he wanted to go if he was ever well enough to go somewhere. The business manager asked if she wanted the trust named anything in particular. She said no. She said it was just for Frank Doyle, and Frank Doyle would know what it was for. She drove to Bangor the following weekend and sat with Frank in his hospital room for 3 hours. He was in a regular room by then, no longer in the ICU, sitting up in bed with a physical therapist's rubber exercise band around his wrists and a copy of a Patrick O'Brian novel open on his lap. He had gained 11 pounds. His eyes were clearer than they had been in the vault, the cloudiness of dehydration and malnutrition beginning to recede, something more present and more specific emerging in its place. They talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. About Edna, who had been his employer, and then his captor's instrument, and then at the very end, the person who had done the only thing she could still do for him. About what he wanted to do when he was strong enough to leave the hospital. About whether he had family anywhere who should be contacted. He had a sister in Vermont, he said, whom he had not spoken to in 21 years because she had believed, along with everyone else, that he had simply disappeared. Gone off somewhere. That happened with people who worked remote estates. People assume things. Clara wrote down the sister's name and contact information and said she would have Patricia Osgood's office reach out to arrange a call if Frank wanted that. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he said yes. He thought he did want that. She drove back to Chicago the following Monday with the windows down. Despite the cold, the spring air coming in off Lake Michigan, as she crossed the state line into Illinois, and she thought about Edna Ashworth the entire drive, about what it costs a person to make one irrevocable choice and then spend the rest of their life as its custodian, about the difference between justice and what Edna had done, which resembled justice in its architecture, but was built from something older and more personal, about what it means to be the last person standing in a family story and whether that position confers obligation or merely opportunity. She thought about her mother, who had known enough about the Ashworth family to cut every tie and say nobody and put the photograph back in the drawer, and who had never explained herself and was no longer available to be asked. She thought she understood now, at least partially. Her mother had grown up knowing what Walter Ashworth had done in 1987. She had grown up knowing that the money in the family was not clean. She had decided that the cleanest thing she could do was leave, and she had left, and she had raised Clara in a small apartment in Evanston on a teacher's salary and medical bills and the particular dignity of a person who has chosen poverty over compromise. Clara thought her mother had been right. She also thought her mother might have understood why, given the specific circumstances, Clara had made a different choice. She paid off her mother's medical bills on a Wednesday morning in May, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open, and the same overhead light that had been burning when the letter arrived transferring funds from the estate account Patricia Osgood had helped her establish. The total amount was $114,000 spread across 6 hospital accounts and 2 collections agencies. She processed each transfer individually. She watched each balance go to zero. When the last one cleared, she closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the years since her mother died in the ordinary private way of grief that happens in kitchens and cars in the middle of the night, and she had nothing left over for the performed variety. What she felt was cleaner than tears and harder to name something in the register of accounts settled of a weight that had been redistributed to where it could be properly carried. She submitted her resignation to the financial consulting firm the following Friday. Her supervisor, a man named Hartwell, who had the specific quality of people who are excellent at their jobs and entirely without imagination, expressed genuine regret and asked if there was anything the firm could do to retain her. She said she didn't think so. She said she had some other work to do. The work she had in mind had taken shape during the 6 months of federal proceedings assembled from various pieces that the trial had surfaced Frank Doyle's 21 years of invisibility. Harold Graves's compliance under coercion, the 1987 pensioners whose losses had gone unaddressed for decades because the primary target of the investigation had died and taken the trail with him. What all of those situations shared, she had come to understand, was not simply the presence of a bad actor. What they shared was the absence of someone willing and able to follow the numbers to their source and to keep following them regardless of what the following cost. The Edna Ashworth Financial Witness Foundation was incorporated in the state of Illinois in June with Patricia Osgood as the registered agent and Clara as the founding director. Its purpose, as stated in the Articles of Incorporation, was to provide legal protection, financial support, and investigative resources to individuals who had uncovered evidence of financial fraud and faced coercion, professional retaliation, or personal risk as a result of that knowledge. It was funded at $12 million from the estate with an additional endowment structure that Patricia Osgood designed to sustain it indefinitely. Clara named it for Edna because Edna had been in the most complicated possible way the person who had made it necessary. In October, 1 year after she had driven through the iron gates of Blackwood Manor in a car with a GPS that had given up and a cell signal that had already failed, Clara drove back to Maine. She had arranged the sale of Blackwood Manor to the Maine Coastal Heritage Trust the previous month. The price was well below market value, a deliberate decision conditioned on a set of requirements. She had negotiated personally the demolition of the East Wing basement vault, filled and sealed and returned to natural grade, the removal of the iron gates and the stone wall, the restoration of the grounds to coastal woodland habitat, and the placement at a point on the cliff path overlooking the Atlantic of a small granite marker. Not a monument, not an installation. A stone roughly dressed set flush with the path with a simple inscription. She had written the inscription herself. It read, "In memory of the men and women whose retirement savings were taken from them by Ashworth Capital Group in 1987. Their losses were real. They were not forgotten. No names of Ashworths, no family history, no architecture of legacy. Just the people who had actually been wronged, set in stone in a place where the ocean could be heard from every point on the path." She stood at the cliff's edge on an October afternoon that was clear and cold in the specific way of coastal New England. In autumn, the light coming off the Atlantic with that merciless northern clarity that makes every edge sharp and every shadow deep, and the line of the horizon as precise as a ruled line on a balance sheet. The iron gates were already gone. The stone wall was being taken down in sections by a Heritage Trust crew she had passed on the access road, the stones being moved aside by hand carefully because the trust intended to use them in the restoration of a fieldstone path through the woodland section of the property. The house itself was still standing because these things take time, but she had been told the east wing would come down first. She thought about Walter Ashworth standing at the edge of this cliff in the autumn of 1991, preparing to become a dead man. She thought about what he must have believed in that moment, that he was smarter than consequences, that patience and intelligence were sufficient to outrun the particular arithmetic of cause and effect, that a man who had built one thing from nothing could build another. He had not been wrong about his own intelligence. He had been wrong about something more fundamental. He had believed that the people he chose as instruments were instruments only, that Clara specifically was a function of her debt and her desperation a variable he had correctly assessed and correctly deployed. He had not considered that a person trained to follow numbers might follow them past the point where he had intended the trail to end. She had followed them. That was all. She had done the one thing she was constitutionally incapable of not doing, the thing that had made her moderately good at a job she had never loved and would have done for the rest of her working life if a letter sealed in dark red wax had not arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. She had followed the numbers until they showed her the truth. The Atlantic moved against the cliff face below with the patient impersonal force of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to continue. The light shifted on the water. A line of cormorants moved south along the coast, low over the surface, purposeful. Clara stood at the edge of the cliff for a while longer. Then she turned and walked back to her car along the path where the stone marker would soon be set through the grounds of Blackwood Manor, where the iron gates had already come down and the October light moved without obstruction through the space where they had been. She drove south as the afternoon faded back through the logging roads and the narrowing coastal routes. In the small towns of mid-coast Maine, the cell signal returning in stages. The world outside the estate reasserting itself in fragments, a text notification, a radio station, the GPS recalculating without drama after its long absence. Walter Ashworth had spent 33 years building a trap. He had built it with patience and intelligence and the absolute conviction that he understood exactly who and what Clara Fenwick was. He had understood one thing correctly. She was indeed a person who would follow numbers wherever they led. He had failed to understand the one thing that mattered. She had not followed them for the money. She had followed them because they were wrong, and because wrong numbers in her experience always pointed somewhere, and because the somewhere they pointed was always in the end the truth. And the truth, however long it had been buried, however deep the vault, however thick the steel, was not something she had ever been able to leave alone.